He was told to wait outside his own father's funeral reception because he didn't belong. The rain had that kind of cold, insistent New York rain that slicks everything down to truth. Hair plastered to foreheads, collars dark with water, shoes crying on marble. James Mitchell stood on the curb beneath a narrow awning, clutching the strap of an overstuffed messenger bag and an umbrella that had somehow inverted in the wind. His suit, the one he'd bought for interviews and parent-teacher conferences, and the one awkward anniversary dinner they'd nearly canceled 2 years ago, had cost $89 at a clearance rack off Queens Boulevard. He could feel the slick fabric cling to his shoulders like a reminder. Through the glass of the upscale reception room, he watched the Westbrooks move like a different species of weather. Patricia Westbrook wore a coat the color of champagne and a laugh that made the waitstaff line up like soldiers. Richard, her husband, had the sort of watch people noticed before his jawline, the sort of voice that made casual cruelty sound ceremonial. Brandon and Melissa, the younger Westbrooks, glided through the room with mouths curved into half-smiles that had been sharpened by private jokes at someone else's expense for so long they might have been born with them. Catherine, his wife, stood near a buffet of smoked salmon and delicate canapes, a napkin folded around a glass of champagne she barely touched. She had the look of someone trying to hold 2 different lives at once, the polite daughter-in-law everyone applauded for marrying up, and the human being whose hands were trembling because grief had widened every seam in her composure. From where James stood, the light inside made her haloed and distant, like a memory he couldn't quite step into. At one point Brandon turned, saw James through the glass and offered a small theatrical bow as if interrupting a theater production to point out the understudy. "Was your car giving you trouble?" he said loud enough for Patricia to snort. "Or did you finally decide to honor the janitor by stepping outside where the rest of us breathe?" A laugh snapped through the room like a match. James felt his face go the color of wet pavement. He looked down at the worn leather of his shoes and the scuffs on the toe where he'd once tripped carrying a stack of overdue library books for his 9th grade history class. A mop and a copy of Thoreau had been his father's presence in their apartment for as long as he remembered. Small, steady things. And now those quiet objects seemed suddenly obscene to the Westbrooks, poor props in their private theater. James pressed his forehead to the glass and watched as Catherine's jaw worked. He didn't know if she saw him. She reached into her clutch, pulled out her phone, and typed a message with thumbs that shook like panicles. When she glanced up, their eyes met. For a second, something like apology, like regret, passed across her face, but the room swallowed it. She smiled at Richard when he said something about arrangements, and then pivoted to Brandon, as if her feet were trained to move on tracks laid long before she arrived. The funeral had been a small, solemn thing. A casket, a minister who said the right words about memory and dignity, a few neighbors and James's colleagues from the middle school who had come to pay respects to the man who cleaned the school at night and helped coach chess on Wednesdays. Robert Mitchell had left behind the sort of life that doesn't show up on glossy invites: a cluttered kitchen, a second-hand truck, a Honda that had once been blue and was now the color of patience. He'd been a janitor at the local junior high for 27 years, and he'd said things like, "Eyes on the next kid," and "salt and sugar at the same time makes you remember your mother." He'd had a laugh you could build a room out of. No one who had known Robert would have thought him a man to hide fortunes. He had been meticulous in other ways. He clipped coupons, kept an envelope for miscellaneous emergencies, and when he found odd jobs, he did them with the kind of pride that belongs to people who fix things quietly. But he also had a habit, the sort of habit that becomes a life if you repeat it long enough, of putting money aside, then putting it aside again. James remembered the rustle of envelopes, the slightly satisfied hum in his father's throat when a little extra tucked away seemed to push the world into order. The Westbrooks had been family by contract, Catherine's family, not his. They had attended the big events like the opening night of a play in which they always expected the best seats. They smelled like privilege and polished wood. They measured everything in invitation tiers and name-brand collars. On that slick night, as rain fretted the city, and the reception clock ticked toward an hour when people decide to say things they will later regret, James stood ankle-deep in cold and felt very small. A silver-haired man in a meticulous suit appeared in the doorway, Marcus Thornton, executor and estate lawyer. He'd been the kind of lawyer people imagine in movies, certain, crisp, and not given to theatrics. When he stepped out under the awning with a thick manila envelope, Rainwater dotted the lapel of his coat like tiny signals. He looked at James for the span of a breath, and in that precise professional manner that softens nothing, announced that everyone was requested back inside for the reading. The laughter stopped. A dozen conversations derailed and drifted toward an awkward eddy. Someone shoved a napkin into their hand and smiled a tight smile that said, "We will pretend we are shocked for appearances." Catherine hurried toward the doorway and hesitated, as if she wanted James to step aside and let her cross into a world that had been altered by wedding bands and a last name.
James walked inside. By the time the mahogany table was crowded with faces, the room felt too small to hold the history that had just been compressed into paper. Chairs scraped. A napkin fell and wasn't noticed. The light above the table was flat and unkind, and it made people look like bad photographs, high cheekbones and practiced astonishment. Marcus opened the envelope. "Robert James Mitchell," he read, voice methodical. There was a legal tone to it, the sort that counts nouns and commas and leaves no space for emotion. "Hereby declares the following dispositions of his estate." The first line was routine: a little money to the church, an old watch to a nephew, the house in Queens to be sold and proceeds split. It was almost the dull cascade of any will until Marcus cleared his throat and the words came like a bucket of cold water. The decedent's estate totals $74,300,000, Marcus said. The room did not immediately understand the size of what they had heard. People blinked as if extra zeros had been written on the wrong side of the page. Champagne glasses paused midway to mouth. Richard Westbrooks' stare fixed on James with a new calculation. "You must be mistaken," Patricia said before she realized she'd spoken aloud. Her face tightened like a purse string. Marcus continued without drama. "To Patricia Westbrook, Richard Westbrook, Brandon Westbrook, and Melissa Westbrook, the sum of $1 each, in consideration of their conduct toward the decedent and his son." A small sound slipped out of Catherine, either a laugh or a sob, James couldn't tell. He felt his chest loosen in, then tighten. The Westbrooks' faces shifted through phases, confusion, indignation, then outrage as the implications settled. Brandon's laugh, which had been an easy weapon all night, grew high and brittle. "And," Marcus said, unfolding another page, "the balance of the estate, after debts and taxes, is left to James Mitchell, son of the decedent, on condition that he review recordings provided by the decedent, amounting to 127 hours, and decide within 180 days whether he wishes to accept in full the terms of this bequest." The room inhaled. The word recordings hung in the air like some private film strip poised to unspool. James's mouth went dry. He had imagined small bequests, something practical, a college fund, final bills covered. Not this strange, conditional legacy, like a puzzle box that might grant him freedom or leave him trapped in the bones of a family he no longer belonged to. Catherine's hand found his under the table for a second, fingers like small anchors, but then her thumb retreated. She looked like someone frightened to touch a wound for fear of making it bleed. A cousin of Patricia's whispered a question about the legality of conditions in a will. Marcus answered in a manner that made it clear he had anticipated such queries.
"Conditional bequests are not uncommon," he said. "They must be reasonably related to the decedent's intent." "And the recordings?" Melissa asked. Her voice was thin with annoyance. "What are they?" "They are the decedent's personal property," Marcus said. "They were delivered to my office in sealed containers and catalogued." He looked at James then, as if the last line were written in a tone only the two of them could hear. "Mr. Mitchell, there are items enumerated in Exhibit B that you will receive. They are personal in nature." James felt something like a current go through him, the low hum you get before storms. People shifted in their seats, the air rearranging itself to hold the new geometry. The idea that a janitor could have amassed $74 million was a blow not only to memory, but to the script the Westbrooks had been following, that those with shine would always retain it, and those without would remain outside, washing the plates. Outside the door, a thunderclap filled the space between sentences. Someone started a rumble of speculation. "Investments?" Brandon offered. "Some crypto scam? Must have been smart." His attempt at a grin landed like a stone. "No scams," Marcus said. "Mr. Mitchell's portfolio was diverse and will be reviewed by counsel. The decedent had a private accountant and held assets through several trust vehicles." The $1 bequests sat at the center of the room like a turd in the punch bowl. The Westbrooks were not stupid. They knew the message, that someone had not only attained riches, but chosen to brand them, was a humiliation that cut deeper than any insult. If Robert had wanted to hurt them, he'd done it with precision, bypassing rumor to land on legal reality, leading them with the trinkets and a public notice. James listened to it all in a kind of disbelief that tasted like copper. The memory of his father folding laundry against the light in their cramped kitchen, hands that knew both grime and generosity, knitted to the legalese in Marcus's mouth in a way that felt unreal. He had been taught to take what life gave, repair what you can, give what you can, and keep a precise sense of gratitude. He had never in his life imagined this kind of bounty would be part of his inheritance, let alone that it would be laid out as a moral test. When the reading ended, the room dissolved into conversations with the edges burnt. A photographer loomed who hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. A woman from a local paper scribbled notes like a ritual. Catherine approached James with a quietness that betrayed something like fear. "I'm sorry," she said, and for the second time their eyes caught, and she didn't know whether to step toward or away. I didn't know he had this." James looked at her, and for the first time that night, saw her as a person with a history, and a chasm between who she'd been and who she'd married into.
You were divorced between Christmas and Thanksgiving, and yet you kept stepping back into the same room, he wanted to say. Instead, he said nothing. Words felt inadequate, like coinage that couldn't buy him back memories. Outside, under the awning again, James watched the Westbrooks exit like a pilfered procession carrying their dignity in paper cups. They were loud now, their outrage a manufactured heat that made the bystanders lean in. They started talking fast, their sentences cold and quick, full of the mechanics of salvage, lawyers, reputations, damage control. "You can't let him get away with this," Richard barked to someone on his phone. "Where did he get the money? He must have hidden it." "Hidden it," Brandon muttered, eyes on James, as if hidden money were a private offense and the finder of it a thief. Some janitor's pockets cannot hold this much. James tugged at the strap of his bag and wanted to tell them, "My father was not a thief. He was methodical, patient. He loved the school because the kids gave him something steady and immediate, small intelligence, messy hands, the way a child apologizes and then eats their snack." But he did not say that. He turned instead toward the car. He had to go somewhere he wouldn't be watched as if he were in exhibit. The rain baptized him as he walked. The city smelled of cold metal and diesel, and something like new possibilities that he was not quite ready to own. A few days later, in Marcus Thornton's office, a place of glass and clean lines that made everything look smaller, James opened those sealed containers. The recordings were cataloged with dates, times, and locations. The box containing Exhibit B had a neat list attached. Christmas 2013, family dinner. Thanksgiving 2017, Westbrook family gathering. July 2019, retirement party. Multiple entries labeled, private conversation, and phone recordings. There was also a letter. Marcus set it on the desk with a kind of reverence. It was short and without flourish, the kind of thing roosters of paper make that insist on being plain so they can be believed. "To my son," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone. I did not have to go very far to become invisible. I worked at night so your days could be brighter. I saved when I could. I wanted you to have choices."
The first recording was a family dinner, the kind that makes sound like light, forks chiming, a TV murmuring in the other room, laughter clipped in the exact places that signal performance. There was a high voice, Melissa, laughing about the color of someone's cheap shoes. "I mean, you can try to look like someone," she said, and the sentence cut off into a laugh line that presumed agreement. "Catherine, you always did have a way of bringing interesting people to events," Patricia said, soft and practiced. They were discussing seating arrangements, guest lists, good china, all things that count in a house built on public opinion. Then a quieter voice, Catherine's, that slipped under the air horn of fortune. "He cleans the school," she said, as if describing an exotic pet. "It's sweet. He does what's expected." The word expected landed like an annotation. James tidy, James compliant, James manageable. James sat there and felt time congeal. It wasn't the barbs that stung. People can be cruel in a dozen subtle ways. But the casualness of it, the way a life could be summarized by others into a single economical adjective, janitor, as if the word could contain the person. He imagined his father behind the wheel of that old Honda, a small light on the dash, a radio playing a song no one else remembered. He pictured him folding shirts in the kitchen, humming while his hands worked. He remembered the pride in his father's walk the day James had won a small school essay contest, the way he had flicked his hand and said, "That's my boy." Pride had always been the sort that gives room. The Westbrooks pride seemed to be the kind that took space. There were softer things on the recordings as well. A snippet of his father teaching a young James to tie a tie, the awkwardness and the laugh when the knot would look wrong. A phone call to James when he was 19, in which his father said he was buying extra stock and that he liked to watch numbers like seasons. It was nothing like lecturing. It was the tone of someone making buckling decisions about future safety. But there were also pieces that hurt and were hard to look at. A conversation between Catherine and Patricia where James's name was a subject like furniture. Useful, movable. "He's a nice man," Patricia said, and the nuance was that nice is an adjective with a back door. It doesn't have teeth. Perfect for children. Perfect for keeping it quiet. Those words were small, precisely aimed things, the kind thrown in late to set context for stories people want to tell. James felt his father in those small things, the way he would lean into a child correction with a whisper rather than a shout. The recordings made everything vivid, like washing a penny to find a face beneath. As he progressed through the first few hours, the narrative of his family, as he'd been allowed to see it, began to rearrange. The Westbrooks' casual superiority stitched through decades of conversation.
They had not been explicitly cruel in public. Their cruelty had been a mode of omission and a set of private jokes. They measured him, and that measurement had been turned into an instruction to others about who he could be in their world. James found himself listening to episodes he had not known existed. A Thanksgiving where Catherine laughed at a joke made at his expense, a phone call where Brandon and a hedge fund partner spoke about clearing liabilities and used his father's name like a line item. There was an oddness to it. People sounded as if they were editing life in real time, cutting off wedges of truth and stowing them where they couldn't be seen. There were hours where nothing devastating happened. The evening sounds of a man humming as he wiped counters, the creak of a house settling. There were also recordings that felt like the deliberate filing of someone else's reputation. They were methodical, like the rest of his father's life had been. Not random slanders, but precise examples and evidence. At one point, James paused the player and sat with his hands on his knees. The room swam with sounds he'd loved, the kitchen clock, the clink of a spoon, his father's low laugh. He was supposed to accept the inheritance after listening to all of it, or refuse. He could see, with an odd and painful clarity, the choices laid before him as though someone had set them on a table and switched on a bright lamp. Accepting the estate would give him the sort of freedom he'd never known. The freedom to stop living paycheck to paycheck, to quit taking extra shifts, and to place his energy in rooms that might change the lives of kids like his students. It would be the key to a life where he could provide the kind of steady scaffolding Robert had tried to build via discipline and thrift. But acceptance also meant keeping, in a new house and under more public light, the memory of private humiliations. The condition, listened to every recording, seemed to be his father's way of making him understand the full truth before he prospered on it. Refusing the estate would be refusal in kind, a moral stance, but it would be also a denial of his father's effort, the secret savings, the late nights of mopping floors with a kind of dignity that never needed applause. The choice was heavy because it was about what James wanted his life to represent, a man who forgave and moved on, or a man who accepted resources to build something larger.
He thought of his students at Anderson Middle School, Maria Rodriguez, who held 2 jobs and still came to after-school tutoring clutching her history notes as though they were treasure maps. Principal Thompson, who had once told him in private that James was the reason a few kids had stayed in school another year. Rachel Kim, who had thrived under his steady, quiet encouragement.
The possibilities of what this money could do were not abstract for him. They arrived as faces and as sentences. Rent for students who had stable homes, books bought for kids whose parents couldn't spare the cash, a bus to take a science class to the museum. When the attorney's receptionist offered him a list of estate advisors and wealth managers, people with slick brochures and talk about impact investing, James's first thought was not about yachts or downtown condos. It was Maria and the way she folded her hands when she was trying to say something important. He pictured a tutoring center with a proper office and heat that didn't cough in the winter, a place where kids like his students could feel the quiet dignity his father had given him. Still, the recordings carried on. There was an entry labeled December 2016, Private Conversation, and the title had a closeness that made the hair on his arms rise. He pressed play. Catherine's voice came across, softer this time, etched with an exhaustion that made its edges blur. "Sometimes I wish things were simpler," she said, and her words did not have the practiced tinge, the polish designed for the dining room. "Sometimes I feel bad for him." Patricia's answer, clipped and precise, cut through with institutional coldness. "We all feel bad for those below us," she said, as if reading a social manual. "But you must understand, Catherine, there's a difference between pity and assimilation." There was a pause. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Catherine whispered. "I just want to be comfortable." Outside the office's wide glass, a city bus sighed, and a delivery man in a yellow vest passed with a stack of packages like small urban offerings. James felt something akin to grief, and then something harder, a resolve assembling itself like brickwork. He could refuse the call for spectacle. He could let the Westbrooks spin whatever rumors they wanted about where the money had come from, and let them keep the vanity of their social circles. He could take the money and use it for a life that would honor the quiet hands that had given him a name, a morality, and a stubborn belief in better outcomes for others. He asked Marcus a question that had nothing to do with numbers. "If I accept, is it mine outright, or are there more conditions?" Marcus looked at him, professional and kind, in a way that made James almost think of a teacher examining a paper. "The will's condition is the listening," Marcus said. "If you establish acceptance within the period, the assets are distributed according to the trust instruments drafted. There are tax considerations, counsel, trustees. It's not simple, but it is manageable." "Do I have to tell them?" James asked. "The family?" "The decedent specified notifications to certain parties," Marcus said. "But how you manage public relations after is your choice."
James thought of the dining room with its smoked salmon platters and the way Brenda had squeezed her cheeks to simulate surprise at his presence. He imagined telling them he'd accepted and watching their faces refactor with a new math. He imagined people like Brandon counting his life in opportunities lost, and he imagined turning that calculus into school buses and scholarships instead. He went home that night to the small apartment he and Catherine had shared, a place with a radiator that banged like a cheap drum in February, and a shelf where his father's old mop sat in the corner like a monument. He set the recording equipment up on a table and started the first of what would turn into late nights and slow mornings, the kind of listening that requires you to trade sleep for truth. The recordings became a map, small roads that led to other roads, to towns of jokes and fields of renderings where his life was a subject for someone else's opinion. He heard Catherine speak in tones he had never heard at the table. He heard brand names and a constant inventory of who belonged where. Listening was not a single revelation, but a grinding of a thing into its pieces until the whole could be reassembled according to facts rather than impressions. By the time the second night blurred into morning, James had made a decision he felt like a person waking after a long illness. He would listen to every hour, every file, and then choose. The sound the files made when they played was something sacred in itself. It was his father's voice, recorded off an answering machine, leaving notes that were both practical and precise. "If you're ever in trouble," his father said on a tape that smelled of old tobacco and lemon cleaner, "keep your head and keep your books. The numbers tell you the truth when people do not." James understood then that the bequest had never been only about money. It had been about the desire to have truth recognized before the life supported by that truth could be claimed. It was about dignity, about the right to bear witness to what a life had been, not as a footnote to someone else's social agenda, but as a complete story. He closed the laptop and stood for a long time. Outside, the city continued to breathe and hustle. In his chest, something settled into a kind of plan. He would not be small because others insisted he stay that way. He would not use the money to humiliate. He would use it to widen doors. A week later, as rain again stitched the city into blurred watercolor, James sat at his kitchen table and made a call. He had never before dialed a number that felt like it would rearrange his life. The person on the other end was calm, patient, and precise. A woman from a law firm Marcus had recommended, someone who did trusts and prenuptial enforcement, and the quiet machinery of protection.
He explained, in a voice that did not crack, that he might accept a conditional bequest, and wanted to make sure he wasn't stepping into a trap that would jeopardize the very things he hoped to build. "What's most important to you?" the lawyer asked at the end of his explanation. "To be able to invest in people," James said. The lawyer wrote something down. "We can set up a trust," she said. "We can protect assets while you comply with the will's conditions, and we can help you manage any publicity so you aren't dragged into a spectacle." He felt a small relief, practical and sharp. The road ahead would involve counsel and trustees, meetings with people who talked in margins and organized files. It would mean long nights listening to more recordings, and it would mean, possibly, facing his wife with the full clarity of what had been said about him in rooms from which he'd been excluded. There were also practical considerations he did not relish: taxes, account audits, the financial people's insistence on paperwork. Marcus told him there would be accountants and trustees, and public statements drafted for op-eds should the press get wind. "If you can," Marcus advised, "be measured. Your father's intent seems to be to give you the option of doing something meaningful. That will have more power if it's deliberate." When James hung up, the sky had that pale light that only late afternoon in the city can have, when everything looks like a photograph found in an old shoebox. He sat with his hands folded and felt an odd kind of gratitude. His father had given him a choice, not a cheap, dramatic revenge, but an opportunity to translate surprise into service. But the recordings had more to give. There was an entry labeled April 2015, phone call, recorded by third party. He stared at the label. His finger hovered over the keyboard before he pressed play. The title of that recording was small and bureaucratic, but James felt its weight as though it were a gavel. The first words were quiet at first, almost conspiratorial, and then they came clear. "We should make sure there's nothing left standing in his way," a man's voice said. He couldn't tell whose at first. Then, soft and almost amused, Brandon's voice. "If it looks like he might inherit, we find a way to make it go away. People believe what money tells them to believe." James' hand went cold against the table. The phrase "make it go away" in a private conversation was ordinary in the mouths of men who believed the world answered to their will. But hearing it named, in the thick, dull way it was, set something like an alarm in him. He listened again. It was not a plan shouted into motion. It was a calculation, an attitude that made little allowances for human dignity. Someone in the recording laughed, a small sound.
"You know the type," the laughter implied. "You toss a little shame in the right places and people will tidy themselves up." James sat with the sound, and for the first time in weeks the question of revenge rose like a sour tide. He imagined a parade of small humiliations, each meticulously arranged by those who conceived of the world as theirs to curate. He imagined the headlines and the whispered gossip. He could have, in that instant, conjured 1,000 ways to return the sting tenfold. But his father's voice on the earlier tape returned to him. "Keep your head and keep your books." The father in the recording had chosen evidence over anger, documentation over spectacle. That had been his habit. The man who had cleaned the school had lived by a kind of moral ledger, and his last act, in sealing recordings, in leaving instructions, had been to make the truth visible enough so that the ledger might balance. James turned the volume down and breathed. He called Marcus and told him about the recording. Marcus wrote down notes with that precise professionalism that had been his armor. "If that recording indicates a plan," Marcus said evenly, "then it is something you might consider handing to counsel and the proper authorities. But let's not do anything that smells like revenge. We'll document. We'll act according to the law." "That's what my father did," James said. "He left evidence, not slogans." "Then we'll treat it the same way," Marcus said. There were quiet hours ahead, and long playlists of files that would seek to dismantle the elegiac version of the family James had once held in his mind.
He knew somewhere in that stack of recordings were the names, the jokes, the sequences that had made every dismissal a cultural code. He also knew there might be moments of tenderness he had not been allowed to keep. The paradox of the thing made him feel like someone standing on the track of the train about to decide whether to move or stay. He shelved the small luxury of imagining public retribution. He would not be that man. Whatever decisions he made, he intended them to be about building rather than breaking. But first, he needed to understand. He needed to listen to all of it. On the third night of the first marathon, when the city had folded itself into a hush and a coat of steel-gray clouds, James pressed play on an audio file labeled May 2018, Private Meeting at Westbrook Estate. The recording opened with the clink of a glass and a voice he knew like a bruise. "You have to make him think it's his choice," Patricia's voice said. "If he feels indebted or honored, the scandal will be smaller." A soft male voice, Richard's, agreed. "We can spin it as a family reconciliation. They love a rags-to-riches arc in this city. We'll be generous and be forgiven." James listened until dawn. He allowed himself to be human in grief, to feel the old wound of being excluded in a room meant to measure status.
He let anger come like rainwater into the gutters, and then he willed himself into the steadier posture his father had taught him. Keep your head and keep your books. When the sun finally pushed through the clouds and caught on the side of the radiator, James sat with a list he had made. Names, dates, a plan that was less about spectacle than structure. He would listen to every file. He would document and consult. He would protect the estate from being siphoned away into legal smoke and vanity. He would, if possible, convert surprise into opportunity for others. He also took a moment, quietly, to go to the school. The hallway smelled of disinfectant and crayons. A teenager stuffed his hair into a cap and waved. The students were still there, in their impossible, fragile, luminous ways. Maria swapped a notebook for a highlighter and looked up with the kind of simple hunger that teachers live to feed. James went into the empty classroom, shut the door, and stood with his palm on the chalkboard. He thought of his father not as a man with numbers, but as someone who believed, in the small, resistant way people believe things, that doing the right thing for the next person mattered more than being seen doing it. The tapes would prove things. They might hurt people in ways that were deserved, and they might complicate his life in ways he could not foresee. But if his father had left him money to buy freedom, then freedom meant the ability to make choices without being limited by the indignities that had once seemed unchangeable. He had been taught to clean up after others. Now he was being asked to steward the cleanup in a larger way. It felt monstrous and holy at once. Later that afternoon, as he prepared to go back to the recordings, his phone buzzed with a name he hadn't expected to see: Catherine. The message itself was formal and small. "Can we talk?" He thumbed back a reply, "Yes," and then hesitated before pressing send. He remembered the look on her face when she had first heard the figure. He remembered the way she had drawn back when she saw what the Westbrooks world could do to someone like him. When they met, it was in a coffee shop that smelled like dark roast and new beginnings. Catherine arrived with eyes raw, not from recent crying, but from sleepless nights, he guessed. She sat down and pushed a folded piece of paper across the table, an envelope with a check, not cashed, not yet signed. "I don't know if this makes amends," she said, voice small, "but I want you to know I'm sorry, and I want to help." James looked at the paper and then at her. There were 1,000 logistical questions in that folded rectangle: taxes, liabilities, the shape of a counted apology. But he saw in her hand something else, an offering of repentance. She had not been a monster in the recordings. She was a person who had made choices that hurt people and wanted, perhaps belatedly, to try to fix them. "I won't take it for us," James said finally.
If you want to help, help the kids. Help make sure the money builds things that last. She nodded as if a weight had been lifted and then carried newly. "I can do that," she said. She folded the check back into its envelope and pushed it across the table toward James, as if she were careful not to crush it under the weight of an apology. Outside, a city bus hissed by, carrying people whose small, ordinary economies had never needed an executor's signature to matter. Catherine watched him with a look that seemed newly constructed from regret and the fear of being unmoored from the identity she'd built. "If you're serious," James said, "then do this. Help us build the tutoring center. Help the kids who tuck papers into their coats because they can't afford folders." She nodded, wordless for a moment, and the rest of the conversation shaped itself into logistics: amounts, accountants, a promise to cut a check to a foundation that didn't exist yet.
She was not repentant in a way that erased the recordings. She was repentant in a way that acknowledged the harm and tried to do something about it. James accepted that. He did not accept her back into the life they'd had. In the weeks that followed, life narrowed into work of a different kind. There were meetings with lawyers, trust officers, and people who spoke about governance and fiduciary duties with the bland confidence of professionals used to translating human drama into bullet points. Marcus Thornton's office became a command center, not of revenge but of careful stewardship. How to take an estate valued at $74,300,000 and turn it into something that would endure beyond headlines. James insisted on an approach that read less like a trophy sale and more like a long conversation with a city. The Robert Mitchell Foundation would focus on tutoring, scholarships, and school repairs in neighborhoods like his. It would not be flashy. It would be practical. Rent vouchers for students in unstable housing, paid internships for high school seniors, subsidized seats for after-school programs. He wanted the foundation to resemble the things his father had deemed necessary: warm coats, a place to study, someone to ask, eyes on the next kid. Marcus advised structure, an irrevocable trust to hold the majority of assets, a small operational account for immediate grant-making, and an independent board that would include educators and community leaders, not socialites. James agreed. He wanted people at the table who smelled like classrooms, people who knew the names of administrators, and who had once eaten cold pizza at potluck teacher meetings.
A piece ran with the headline that suggested their public civility and private press had not always been matched by the tax filings that sustained conspicuous wealth. The phrasing was careful: reported irregularities, apparent discrepancies, calls to financial advisors asking for clarifications. The recordings James had turned over to Marcus, and which Marcus, with James's consent, delivered to the IRS through counsel, became a file that prosecutors and auditors could not entirely ignore. 2 IRS agents, Sarah Chin and Marcus Wu, were assigned to review the material. They were efficient, methodical, and had the kind of fatigue that comes from expecting the rich to be clever. They treated evidence like a ledger, and the recordings were, in their hands, pages. When the first notice of an audit arrived at the Westbrook address, there was no immediate meltdown. There were at first threats, and then attempts to preempt. Public relations consultants were hired. A press statement was drafted that framed the family as cooperating and confident in their records. But the pressure of an audit is practical and granular. It is not satisfied by spin. Paper must match paper. Money must trace its path. Brandon, who had spent years cultivating a persona as a sharp young fund manager, found himself fielding investor calls he had once only ever initiated. Reported suspensions of withdrawals at his fund followed as longtime clients, jittery at the smell of impropriety, asked for clarity. Headlines about the scrubbing of portfolios and redemption freezes circulated in the kind of finance Twitter that obsessed over tiny edges. The rhythm of social life and capital markets is different, but both can collapse on a single point of failure: trust. The Westbrooks' defensive posture widened into legal fights and the slow cavitation of reputation. For them, the humiliation James had felt on that rain-slicked night iterated in reverse. Privilege that had been assumed to be a protective blanket became a public vulnerability. Friends for whom their standard was convenience and access began to distance themselves. People who had previously paraded with them on invitation lists found it safer to be quietly neutral. James watched the unspooling with a strange lack of satisfaction. He was not indifferent. He understood that what he had set in motion, by listening, by accepting evidence, by choosing the legal path, would hurt people and damage livelihoods. That was not his aim. His aim was to honor the life his father had lived and the truth his father had quietly catalogued. "There is an appetite in the public to see a comeuppance," Marcus called him once in the kind of voice that was both comforting and blunt, but public appetite is not a legal strategy. James wanted to make sure that whatever consequences arrived, they would be the result of evidenced wrongdoing, if any existed, and not a spectacle.
The IRS's investigations, as they continued, were described in the press as ongoing inquiries and initial audits. Lawyers for the Westbrooks issued statements of cooperation. The dance of legal language filled the gap where gossip had once reigned. Meanwhile, the foundation's initial grants were deliberate and small enough to be careful, but large enough to matter. The first announcement read, in part, "The Robert Mitchell Foundation will seed tutoring centers in 5 community schools, fund scholarships for students in need, and offer stipends to teachers who run after-school programs." The numbers attached were modest in the context of the total estate: an initial operating fund of several $1,000,000, an endowment structured to disperse meaningful, sustainable grants over the long term. But James had learned early that small but consistent resources often produced the biggest changes in communities that had been left on the margins. There were ceremonies, the kind small foundations do: a ribbon cutting at a former storefront that had smelled for years like damp paint, a photo of James with Principal Thompson and Maria, smiling in a way that balanced pride and gravity. Reporters slotted the story between a line item about legal probes and a weekend magazine piece on resilience. The city's education reporter called it the most quietly radical philanthropic move of the year, a phrase that pleased James because it meant less about his image and more about what would happen in classrooms.
Maria was the first concrete example of the foundation's purpose. She had been a sophomore when James had first noticed her, a girl who read history like someone hunting for shelter. She worked 2 part-time jobs to pay for groceries for her family, stayed for after-school help, and would give the briefest, brightest smile whenever James handed out graph paper. The scholarship the foundation offered her covered a semester of community college and a small stipend to reduce her need to work nighttime shifts. She took it like someone taking a seat in a room she had been told she could not enter. In a small application essay, Maria had written, "If there is someone in the world who thinks I've got what it takes, I'll keep trying until the thought is right." James remembered that line when he visited the tutoring center and found her bent over a table with 3 other students, explaining the causes of the Civil War as though they were weather patterns you could predict if you knew how to read charts in the sky. He watched her gently correct another kid's punctuation. He felt in those moments that the money was doing what it was supposed to, creating a set of conditions in which potential could be recognized as such. The foundation staff, made up of teachers and community organizers, not hot philanthropy veterans, ran workshops on grant applications and built a small, relentless pipeline of help.
The first year, they provided 50 need-based scholarships, 3 paid internships with city nonprofits, and what James liked to call emergency dignity funds that could cover rent for a family at risk of eviction or buy a winter coat for a child who showed up to school in thin layers. Numbers were not the whole story, but they mattered. The 50 scholarships meant 50 young people who could think about their futures without the immediate arithmetic of survival crowding out choice. There were complications, of course. The foundation was not immune to the noise around the Westbrooks. An Abed questioned whether money from a contested estate should be used to fund programs before all audits were complete. A conservative columnist accused James of using his father's money to settle scores. Each piece required a calm answer, statements crafted to emphasize process, transparency, and the foundation's mission. James learned to be less offended by bad faith questions and more committed to the quiet work of results. At the same time, the recordings continued to play. They were no longer only the instruments of revelation, they were lessons in the anatomy of small cruelties and the architecture of casual exclusion. They also included tendernesses James had not wanted to lose, his father's voice telling him to keep his head, an older sister's laugh caught on a voicemail, a birthday card read aloud in a tone thick with affection. The files complicated the people who had been cruel and rescued other memories that felt indispensable. Months passed. Legal teams negotiated settlements, not theatrically, but in the slow, meticulous way that real legal work unfolds. Subpoenas, depositions, the kind of paperwork that is its own ecosystem. Several trustees and legal advisors appeared in suits and began to shepherd the estate through probate and distribution. There were taxes to be estimated, trusts to be drafted, and investment committees to be formed. There were practical decisions, how much to keep liquid for immediate impact versus how much to seed an endowment. James slept poorly in that first year, as though his father's life and the city's appetite sat in the same room and argued until dawn. He found himself waking with lists running along the backs of his eyelids, scholarship names, contractor contacts, IRS contact numbers. He learned to read legal language like a history teacher learns to read a primary source, attentive to tone, suspicious of what was omitted, careful with inference. The Westbrooks, in the public imagination, had shifted from polished hosts to a family requiring damage control. That control was imperfect. An old friend of theirs leaked a voicemail in which Patricia's voice sounded brittle while discussing reconstructing narratives. The leak cost them allies who prized discretion. A private lawsuit regarding alleged financial irregularities was reported by a few national outlets.
The language was careful, alleged, and reported, but the cumulative effect on their social standing was clear. Doors previously automatic started closing or opening only with effort. Brandon's firm, which had been a luxury in a decade of risk-taking and high fees, saw investors demand clear accounting. Reported redemption freezes and a loss of major backers thinned the fund's lead. The firm's value, which had been a quiet brag in the Westbrook holiday speeches, contracted in the face of real-world liabilities and client withdrawals. It was not a melodrama. It was a consequence of people deciding quietly and then loudly who they trusted with money. When the dust settled enough to measure results, the foundation had already begun to produce things that looked like small miracles. A third-grade classroom on the South Bronx received repaired heaters and new books, installed under a grant James had insisted be small and fast. The students held the books like contraband. A high school senior named Terrence, who had been on track to drop out to work in a warehouse, took an internship at a local community clinic funded by the foundation and later enrolled in evening classes for nursing. Maria matriculated to a community college and months later took a paid summer internship coordinating tutors at the foundation center. The city noticed in the way it often notices useful things, with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity.
The New York Times ran a feature about unexpected legacies, in which James was quoted carefully. "My father didn't leave me a headline, he left me a chance to be useful." That sentence, simple, fraught, was clipped and repeated on social feeds and in conversations at barbershops and teachers' lounges. It attracted both praise and those who saw virtue as a luxury good. Catherine, who had reappeared in small ways, did more than write checks. She volunteered once at the tutoring center, where she sorted books and set up chairs as if trying to learn how ordinary labor felt in her hands. She led a drive to buy winter coats, and the photos of her handing out jackets were shared by the foundation's social media with captions that emphasized need over redemption. The offer had been made to her to atone with action and to cut a piece of her life loose from old patterns. She accepted in a practical way that involved work rather than performative statements. When she asked to speak to James in private months later, it was not a plea to reconcile. It was instead a fragile inventory, the life she'd been given, how she'd been taught to measure worth by attendance lists and guest appearances, and the slow collapse of those measures in the light of documented reality. She apologized with a crispness that suggested practice. "I am sorry for what was said," she told him. "I am sorry for what I let happen." James listened. He accepted her apology insofar as forgiveness is sometimes a civic act rather than a private restoration.
He did not rekindle the domestic arrangements they had once had. He told her simply that the foundation needed the money more than he needed the marriage. She agreed. They parted with a handshake that was not cold, but was not warmth either, a clean severing rather than a tearful entanglement. That separation did not mark cruelty. It marked an honesty that James had cultivated in himself. The recordings had taught him the difference between retribution and stewardship, and his father's life had taught him the discipline to choose the latter. There were other, more painful reckonings. Old friends who had once hesitated around him because of class unease sought him out to apologize. Some were genuine, others were theatrical, strategic attempts to align with a new patron. James learned to distinguish between the two by watching whether apologies came with action, volunteering time, showing up at a center for one afternoon, introducing himself to a principal, and asking how he could help. He rewarded sincerity with invitations to table discussions and left the rest to the market of social capital. The legal aftermath of the Westbrook inquiries remained unresolved in public detail for some time. Much of what moved in courtrooms happened in document exchanges and settlement talks that rarely make dramatic copy. What the city saw, however, was a family compact that had, by the force of evidence, lost some of its sheen. The consequences were not poetic, they were practical. Decreased invitations, fewer investments, a narrowing of the immediate social world that had been their stage. When questions emerged about whether James had been vindictive, he answered with a small list of facts, all of which emphasized process. He had complied with the will's conditions. He had turned over the material to proper counsel and to authorities. He had established a foundation that focused on service. He refused to dramatize those facts into a narrative of punishment. "My father left a ledger," he told a reporter once, "and that ledger showed what had been said, not what I should become." Part of being a steward, James realized, was also taking the long view on healing. Punishing people to satisfy a crowd's thirst changes the person doing the punishing more than it fixes the underlying social habits that create cruelty. The foundation's work, by contrast, aimed to create structural shifts, tutoring to close gaps, scholarships to open college doors, stipends so young people could breathe enough to learn. The Robert Mitchell Foundation also created a scholarship named for Robert's old school route, the Night Custodial Fund, meant for those who worked overnight jobs while attending school. James remembered his father's shift times and the way those hours had been a kind of invisible scaffold holding other people's days. The scholarship targeted students who had irregular schedules, so they were not penalized for earning a living while studying.
In a year and a half, the foundation reported measurable outcomes that were modest in scale but rich in meaning. 50 scholarships dispersed, 3 after-school centers opened, and a small endowment set up to ensure steady funding for mentorship programs. The press noted the numbers. For James, the metrics were human. Maria's acceptance letter to community college folded into his pocket like a small prayer. Terrence's internship reports read like confirmation notes. There were moments that tested his restraint. An old neighbor, who had once seen Robert leave for night shifts, came to the tutoring center and whispered a memory of the father who had saved in envelopes and in actions. He wanted to hug James with the kind of gratitude that is almost embarrassing because it is unearned. James accepted the hug, and the connection felt like a kind of purification, not of the family that had injured him, but of a life that had been lived with quiet dignity.
The most public moment came on the Foundation's formal launch day. It was a modest affair, a press room, a short speech by James, a handful of community members and teachers, and a table filled with the nomination forms for the first round of scholarships. There were cameras, but the focus was on the people lined up with filled-out applications, their faces taut with hope. James spoke for a few minutes, not to claim victory, but to insist on the ordinary work of care. "My father taught me something simple," he said. "He taught me that dignity looks like being counted. This foundation exists because I want to be part of a city that counts everyone." A reporter asked the obvious question, had he ever considered using the money to seek vengeance? James's answer was measured. "Vengeance is a private thing that corrupts the public good," he said. "I was given a chance to do something constructive. I'm taking it." And so the foundation folded itself into the city's ecology of aid. Grants that seemed small in the face of systemic inequality turned out to multiply when steered by teachers who knew where to plant them. Half a dozen school libraries were restocked. A classroom in the Bronx that had been cold in winter had a heater fix that December. These fixes were not the same as policy change, but they were the kind of levers that shifted a child's ability to learn in the immediate term. Not that everything moved smoothly. The Foundation's decisions were scrutinized by people both benign and cynical. There were questions about governance, about how large donors should influence programming, about the bureaucracy that naturally grows around money. James, who had spent his life in classrooms rather than boardrooms, had to learn how to defend the choices he found morally urgent in the language of policy and impact. Through it all, the recordings continued to be a moral compass of a different kind.
Some files included moments of remorse that complicated the narrative of cruelty, an off-the-record call in which Patricia admitted, in a tone of fatigue, that she was afraid of losing what she knew. Those moments didn't absolve behavior, they simply made the people involved more human and the repairs more complicated. James welcomed that complexity. It allowed him to make space for forgiveness that's conditional and practical, rather than theatrical. The foundation also prompted unexpected alliances. A community college dean reached out offering to partner on a dual enrollment program. A retired principal volunteered to run a mentoring program. There were grants from other small philanthropic groups that admired the foundation's focus on classrooms rather than glossy names. The city offered partnership on renovations, matching some of the foundation's early investments in school infrastructure. Months into the foundation's work, Maria wrote a letter that James kept in a drawer. "Because someone believed I could, I have learned to believe it too," she wrote. That sentence became a small talisman he read when the weight of administration felt too heavy. The relationship with Catherine remained functional and boundaried. She continued to volunteer on occasion and made contributions to specific programs. Their interactions were respectful and framed by a new distance. They shared a history that had been tangled with inequality and an unshared future. James had, over long nights of listening and days of planning, decided that his life would not be defined by the imperative to reclaim what had been taken from him emotionally, but rather by the obligation to do good with what he'd inherited materially. One crisp autumn morning, as the tutoring center buzzed with after-school activity, James walked through the rows of students who bent over flashcards and laptops. Sunlight slatted through the windows and caught dust motes like little suspended promises. He found Maria at the back table, helping a younger girl with multiplication. When she saw him, she smiled in that way that doesn't weigh itself down in the adult calculations of pity or fame. It was simple affirmation. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "the tutor program is getting its first cohort into a summer internship. The hospital accepted Terrence. He starts in June." James felt that unique mixture of pride and relief that comes from seeing the potential invested actually produce results. It wasn't the consequence he had imagined that night at the reception, waiting in the rain. It was quieter, more tedious, and more durable. The foundation published its first annual report the following year. The report's pages were modest: program descriptions, beneficiary profiles, a breakdown of grants dispersed, and a section on governance with the names of trustees who included teachers and community advocates.
The numbers were conservative but meaningful. The 50 scholarships, the 3 centers, the emergency funds used to prevent evictions. The document closed with a short letter from James, in which he wrote that wealth, in his father's tradition, was an instrument of potential rather than a spectacle. "I don't think my father wanted walls or praise," James wrote. "He wanted a life that could be counted on." There was a phase where people asked him publicly whether he regretted the recording's exposure, whether the private knowledge of cruelty had damaged anyone's chance to reform. His answer was steady. Evidence, when responsibly disclosed and processed through the right channels, is a vehicle for accountability. It is not theater. It is a ledger that either stands up to scrutiny or doesn't. Years later, the Westbrooks had repaired some of their social standing. People at that social scale have resources to rebuild their reputations if they choose.
Some made gestures of contrition, others retreated into quieter lives. The city's memory, which loves narratives of fall and rise, made room for the next scandal and the next human interest story. For James, the point had never been being remembered in tabloids. It had been about building things that lasted. There were nights when he still listened to a recording for no reason other than to hear his father's voice say, in that half-joking, half-sage tone, "Keep your head and keep your books." Those nights reminded him that the inheritance had been less about cash and more about a method for arranging life, the quiet, patient accumulation of small acts that, over decades, become large consequences. Toward the end of the second year, the foundation funded a renovation of a community library in a neighborhood that had been starved of public investment. The library, with its new shelves and lights and a small study room sponsored by the foundation, became an anchor. On opening day, a line of children waited for hot chocolate and the chance to pick new books. A woman who had worked nights for 20 years said, with a voice that trembled, that she had never imagined a place like this in her neighborhood. James stood in the crowd, watching, and felt an odd, uncomplicated joy. When reporters asked what he would have done differently, he often gave the same answer. "I would have listened sooner, not to recordings, but to the people in the room. Teachers, principals, students. The money is only useful when it follows those voices." In small moments, James permitted himself a private tally. Months that were sleepless and redolent with paperwork had created a tutoring center where a child could stay warm and do homework. Modest scholarships had opened doors to community college. Stipends had allowed interns to stay in town and study without leaving for overnight shifts. These were the marginal gains that, in his father's ledger, equaled something close to dignity.
There were quiet reconciliations that had nothing to do with legal outcomes. An aunt of his father came to a holiday event at the center and placed her old hands on James's face in a blessing that could not be bought. She said, "Your father would be proud." Those words landed more solidly than any public accolade. Publicly, the story of the janitor-turned-heir sometimes retained a tinge of the sensational. Pundits loved narratives of reversal, but the work James did forced the story into a longer tale, one of sustained impact rather than instant spectacle. He learned to tolerate the headlines and to treat them as background noise, against which the more ordinary work of change persisted. On an anniversary of the funeral, James stood alone outside the church for a moment and remembered the rain, the inverted umbrella, the $89 suit. He felt the old knots of humiliation unspool into something else. Not forgetfulness, but a form of integration. He had not sought retribution. He had chosen, stubbornly, to make generosity the main drama of his life. Catherine's life, too, had rearranged. She sought quieter pleasures and slower commitments. She continued to volunteer with the foundation on the terms they'd agreed upon, and through steady work she seemed to find a sense of purpose that had not been available in the social orbit she had once inhabited. Her presence at the tutoring center was not a return to what they'd had, but a different kind of participation, patchwork restitution through labor and money placed into communal projects. As the foundation matured, James hired a small staff of educators and program managers who would outlast founders in moods. He took on the role he had always been good at, not the benevolent donor at a gala, but the person who listened to a teacher's problem and arranged a solution. His father, who had taught him how to measure things by their human effect rather than their flash, would have approved. The city, in its messy way, absorbed the foundation into its patchwork of nonprofits and public services. Some programs were successful and scaled, others required adjustment. James learned to be open to failure as well as to success. He became adept at convening meetings where the best solution was often the one assembled by people who actually did the work, not the donors with the most persuasive PowerPoint. One spring afternoon, a former student who had been in James's 9th grade history class walked into the tutoring center. He carried a folder with a job offer letter from a local nonprofit and had a nervous smile. "I couldn't have done this without the tutoring," he said, as though naming gratitude were a small miracle. James told him, truthfully, that the students were the point. When the man named him a mentor, James felt again that same deep, unshowy satisfaction that had kept him going through paperwork and audits and long nights.
In the epilogue of that piece of life, James had gained something that no headline could properly convey, a practice of stewardship anchored in dignity. He had used his father's money to buy other people's options, a scholarship, a repaired heater, a bus ticket to a museum, small leverages that could alter life trajectories. The wealth, he discovered, had been a tool to create moral space, freedom to make choices that did not revolve around survival. When the foundation published its 5-year impact review, it included concrete outcomes: more than 200 scholarships awarded, 3 renovated school facilities, and thousands of tutoring hours logged. It also included profiles: Maria, now studying education with a plan to become a teacher; Terrence, enrolled in nursing; the mentorship program that helped a cluster of seniors get internships. The numbers meant less to James than the sentences that described lives altered. Yet the numbers helped fund the next year's work. On a quiet evening, years after that rain-slick funeral, James sat at his kitchen table and opened a letter from an unexpected source. A woman who had once been a friend of the Westbrooks, now writing to acknowledge that humiliations and class divisions had once seemed like elaborations of taste rather than moral failures. She enclosed a small check and asked for anonymity. James took it and funneled it into the emergency fund. It did not matter who sent it. It mattered that someone no longer saw dignity as a commodity to be conferred only on those who already possessed it. In the end, the story that had begun with a man told to wait outside his father's reception because he didn't belong settled into a different shape. The humiliation did not disappear. It remained, a scar that taught vigilance. But the larger effect, a foundation that anchored after-school programs, scholarships, and a modest rebuilding of what had been neglected, created an afterlife for his father's work that was generous rather than merely corrective. At the foundation's annual gathering in a small rented gym, James watched the room fill with people he had once taught, parents who had been helped, and teachers who had taken the chance to apply for grants. Maria, now a college sophomore, was on the stage giving a short speech about the first time she had seen a heater that actually worked in her old school. The laughter and applause that followed were not for James alone. They were for the accumulation of small, sustained mercies. After the event, a reporter asked him what being a billionaire, the word some headlines had borrowed as shorthand for fortune, had felt like. James smiled gently. "I never was a billionaire," he said. "For many people, billionaire is shorthand for a life where money buys immunity. I had a different inheritance, a chance to make things fairer, to fix things my father could not fix in his lifetime."
That's not the same as being above others. It's the ability to stand beside them. He walked home that night with the same small satisfaction he'd felt when he first decided to accept the bequest. The work was messy, slow, and sometimes infuriating, but it followed his father's oldest lessons: patience, attention to detail, and a stubborn belief that doing small things well can, over time, reshape a landscape. Years later, when he spoke at a city school commencement about legacy, he told the students not to wait for miraculous fortunes to change the world. "Start where you are," he said, "with what you can do for the person next to you." He paused and thought of the man who had once mopped school floors and clipped coupons, and in the end left a ledger for his son to use. "My father," James said, "made me promise to listen. I did. I listened to recordings, yes, but more importantly, I listened to people. That's how I learned what a fortune is for." The memory of that rain-lashed evening by the awning had lost its immediate sting. It remained as a fulcrum, a moment whose gravity had set the course for something larger than a family fight. The humiliation that had once seemed like a final verdict had become for James a threshold, an apprenticeship in dignity that he had translated into a steady practice of giving. As the tutoring center's lights went out late one winter night, the janitor, a man who had worked at the after-school program and who reminded James of his father in small ways, swept the floor with a mop that had seen better days. James watched him at work and felt the loop close in a humane way. The foundation had not erased the past, nor had it punished endlessly. It had instead created conditions where forgiveness, restitution, and the slow rebuilding of community could take hold. He had not married Catherine again. He had not sought to humiliate the Westbrooks beyond the evidence-based consequences that unfolded through audits and market reactions. He had instead accepted the responsibility his father had placed in his hands, to be someone who built something that mattered. The wealth, in the end, had been less about personal elevation and more about opening a few more doors for other people. If any moral remained, James thought, it was this: real wealth is what lets you choose the life you believe you ought to live, and the measure of that wealth
is how many people get invited through the door you open. If this story moved you, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell us in the comments, what would you do if you found yourself stewarding a life you didn't expect?